Spiegelhalter?
Yes, Your Honor. To hit briefly on something we were just talking about so we don't lose that train of thought, you testified a couple of times about disassociation and how someone testifying about their rape or about their trauma would not be prone to show emotion. Is that correct?
I said that they may or they may not. It really depends on, again, the psychological background of the person, their preparation in terms of previous traumas in their life, and the level of dissociation they experienced during the actual trauma.
How many times did you talk to Fatima about her trauma?
I spoke, for the evaluation, I spoke to her once for a 2.5 hour period of time at the detention center.
And you didn't speak to her on any other time?
I met with her 2 or 3 times since she has been released from detention because she had concerns with insomnia.
Okay, and did you discuss her torture on each of these occasions?
No, we focused more on the things that were happening currently.
Okay, so only once did you talk about her torture?
Yes.
And on that occasion, she didn't cry about that, for instance?
No, she was very, again, she displayed dissociation in that she looked down. She did not display any emotion at all.
You work for the Liberty Center for Survivors of Torture, correct?
Yes, I do.
Could you describe the work of that organization for me?
The Liberty Center exists to work with rehabilitation for survivors of torture. We're funded under the Torture Victims Relief Act through the federal government. We provide both training for professionals, lawyers, doctors, educators, and social workers and psychologists in the area of identifying survivors of torture and working with survivors of trauma from other cultures. And then we work directly with survivors of torture in a variety of areas, legal, social services, medical, and psychological services.
Do you receive any pay for working with people who have PTSD?
I'm the director of the center, and I get paid specifically for that role.
If you have additional people who have PTSD, does the center receive more money from the government?
No, we do not.
Have you ever testified in court that someone did not have PTSD?
Yes, I've testified in court, and then the center itself goes through a screening process where we decide whether we are going to offer legal services to a particular client. If the client is found to be incredible, we do not, and we reject about 20% of the request for psychological evaluations.
And is PTSD universally accepted in the scientific community?
PTSD has been accepted for over now probably about 60 years, since the early 1950s. It has gone through several changes in terms of the diagnostic manual for mental disorders, but has existed since 1950 firmly.
Now, is that a yes, it's universally accepted by experts in the field?
Yes, it is.
Every expert would tell me PTSD exists.
Objection, Your Honor.
I think she's answered the question. Move on.
Now, you testified it's possible for an individual to fake PTSD, is that correct?
Absolutely.
Okay. And the diagnostic tool, when you say someone has faked PTSD, does that mean that they have survived the diagnostic tool, and even though they're faking, they have been diagnosed with PTSD? Is that what you mean by that?
I'm sure
phrase?
that in some cases that does occur.
Okay. And you say that someone has a flat affect if they are if they have PTSD. Is that correct?
No, that is one of the possible, but not the only consequence of PTSD.
Okay. So some people may have flat affect, some people may not.
Some people may have flat affect. Some people may be overwhelmed by their emotions and be unable to speak because of being overwhelmed by emotions as well.
So it's fair to say that people who suffer trauma, a fairly wide swath of people might fall into this PTSD bucket. Is that correct? I mean, it could be people who are flat affect, people who are animated, people.
No, PTSD is based on, again, the 5 different criteria, and within those 5 different criteria, there are about 20 different symptoms that are indicative of post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder is not based on one symptom.
So if there are 5 criteria and there are 20 different ways to meet each criteria, you have 100 different ways to meet the PTSD test. Is that what we're
No,
saying?
you have to meet a certain scope of symptoms within each area.
Is there physical evidence of PTSD?
There is an exaggerated startle response, which actually can, there are some studies where it can be caught on very specific kinds of receptors at different points in the body in terms of when somebody hears a loud sound, they have a much higher and much quicker nervous system response. Their heart rate goes higher, their hands begin to sweat, they have some kinds of physical symptoms.
Did you test that with Fatima?
No, those are very, very complicated, sophisticated tests that are not generally done in the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. Those are generally being done in research facilities.
Well, did you testify that she had an increased startle reflex?
She did, and that was something that we saw during the interview. If there was a sound outside, she would jump and get nervous. Those are things that she described when somebody knocks on the door, her feeling of rapid heartbeat, being unable to breathe, having her hands sweat. Those we got through observation and through her objective opinion.
But more anecdotally than hooking her up to sensors and
Yes.
less scientifically.
Objection, Your Honor.
I'll allow it. Continue.
Let's talk about the diagnosis. You said that you spent 2.5 hours with her, and then on other occasions you didn't talk about the torture at all. Is that correct?
It's not that we didn't talk about the torture at all. We did not go through a full torture interview. We were dealing very specifically with her nightmares and insomnia, which had something to do with the torture, but we were not going through a torture history at that point.
Okay. Well, you said that she was missing symptoms. Is that correct?
Sure. Within the 20 symptoms within each of the areas, different individuals are going to have different experiences depending on their own personal mental health history, the mental health predisposition within their family and culture, and other kinds of, for other kinds of reasons. So there are some very classic symptoms that Fatima did not exhibit, again, that are more well known, and there are some more symptoms that are common but that have not been publicized that she did exhibit.
Any further questions?
Do I need to wrap up, Your Honor? Is that
Yes, you do. It's getting rather late. And so
message received? I think that's all the questions I have.
Okay, very briefly, any redirect from...
Very briefly, Your Honor. Did you think at any point, and do you think now, that Fatima faked PTSD or malingered?
No, I do not.
Thank you.
I just have one question, Doctor, and that is, if I'm reading your statement right and listening to your testimony, what you can testify to is that something very bad happened and there was after effects, but you, for example, would there be a difference? Would you be able to distinguish if this was some type of domestic violence or the causation was some type of personal thing where she suffered and a similar type injury or harm? You can point the causation to...
What I would say is that her symptoms are very congruent with the specific story, with the specific experiences that she described to us. Mm-hmm. The particular kinds of nightmares that she's having, the flashbacks, are all around the very specific incidents that she describes in her testimony.